my topic is we want to keep the farm in the family, now what? Getting started with succession planning. And when we were getting this seminar together, I knew I wanted to talk about something about succession planning. And I've talked here different years about different estate planning tools, trusts, nursing home planning, and lots of kind of nuts and bolts things. But as I thought about it, I wanted, so if you thought that today coming here I was going to give you the 10 steps to transfer your farm, and here's the perfect solution, you're going to be disappointed. Because unfortunately, there's not one solution. And instead I thought I would focus on some of the things that I find that it's really helpful for people to have thought about and considered long before they're thinking about transitioning the farm. And I will say that when I meet with clients for the first time to talk about succession issues, the first question out of the client's mouth can be on kind of one of two extremes. Sometimes people come into me and they say, I'm here because I need to form an LLC. I say, okay, what makes you think that you need or want an LLC? Well, I want to transition, and that's how you do it. You have an LLC. Or they'll come in and say, I need a land contract. And, I'll say, why? And then sometimes I'll ask questions like, well, have you talked to your tax preparer or your accountant about that? Well, no, but I talked to Joe down at the cafe, and he said, that's the way to go. And, to me, someone coming in and saying they need a specific thing is sort of like saying, well, I need a sledgehammer. Well, that's a great tool if you're knocking down a wall. It's maybe not a great tool if you're trying to hang a picture. And so a lot of what I do with clients is trying to find out what job we're trying to accomplish before we pick our tool. So that's kind of one extreme, where folks come in and they think they know exactly what they need, and they've just come to, get this magical piece of paper that's going to take care of everything. The other extreme is when people come in and they say, well, we want to transition the farm, we want to keep it in the family, what should we do? And as I said, there's no one answer to that question, because there are a whole lot of factors that come into play that have to do with your particular farm, your particular family, your financial situation, the interest of another generation to come in and be involved with the farm. And so if you're working with somebody who tells you there's a single way to accomplish this goal, it kind of makes me think of that Henry Ford quote about, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. In my mind, we have a huge toolbox of tools to help facilitate farm succession transfers. And oftentimes we're not just picking one of those tools. We may need the hammer and the screwdriver, and heck, we may need that sledgehammer too. But absent more information about you and your farm and your goals, it's really hard for me to answer that question of what should we do. And so where my talk today is going to be is trying to be in the middle. And really what led me here is I meet with Bob Bosold at Wax Radio once a month, and some of you may have heard we do a recording once a month and talk about various issues about succession planning or other issues related to farming. And he's always asking me, I talk to all these people, and I'm out at the fair, and I'm out at the dairy breakfast, and everybody, they're concerned about these things, but where do we start? And so that's where my presentation today is going to focus on, is that getting started phase. And a lot of this stuff is going to feel soft, particularly when you follow Tammy with all those nuts and bolts and numbers and percentages and all of that stuff. But I find that it's really, I think these soft subjects are really the hard part of succession planning. And they tend to be the places where we get stalled. And so hopefully in thinking about some of these things and working this through as you're, sitting in the combine or out spreading manure or, whatever kind of mindless tasks that might be in your day-to-day. You can think about these things and think about talking about them with your family. And I'm hoping that these topics will be helpful, both if maybe you're that senior generation thinking about transitioning out of the farm or working our way toward retirement. Most farmers never truly retire, but at least we get a little closer to retirement. As well as if maybe you're that generation looking to transfer in and trying to figure out, where might my place be in the farm. So what I'm going to talk about today is starting out by figuring out what it is we have, counting the beans, then setting that goal. What do we really want to accomplish with our transition plan? By that point, we might be feeling a little overwhelmed, and so we're going to do a little divide and conquer and think about separating out sort of a disaster plan from more of an ongoing transition plan. Rainy day, I'll have you know, I ordered the weather today. It's a perfect day to be sitting in a conference, as opposed to our first 3 days of the week that were awfully beautiful for this part of the fall. In talking about how the importance of actually building some wealth outside of the farm assets can be important in that transition plan. Then we're going to count those beans again, and we're going to start thinking about financial needs in retirement. And finally, mustering the troops, getting your team together to help get a succession plan in place. So let's start out with counting those beans. What do I have? This may seem awfully fundamental, right? That if we're going to think about transitioning assets, that we need to know what we have. And while in some ways, coming up with that list of assets may seem really easy, it can be surprisingly difficult sometimes. Well, how many acres do you have? Well, I think it's 420. Well, no, that was before we bought that other 80 from the neighbor. Well, maybe is it 522? It can be sometimes be amazing how hard it is to put that together. But it's really hard for us to start planning for transition if we don't even know what we have. And so I usually start people with putting together an asset list, and rather than starting with that blank piece of paper, I suggest often you have to be updating with your bank or financial institution, kind of an annual balance sheet, and that can be a great place to start. So starting with pulling that out. The other thing to do is pull out all that old paperwork. Those deeds that have been sitting in the safe deposit box or the lock box, that paperwork from maybe when you bought that 40 or you bought the cattle from mom and dad. And let's take a look at that and make sure you really do own what you think you own. I can't tell you how many times recently we started pulling out documents and maybe some land has been purchased from someone on land contract, but we never satisfied that land contract and actually got a deed for that property. It's not a big deal if the people we bought it from are still alive and able to sign off on that deed. It gets a little more complicated if they're not around anymore to get someone authority to do that. So I've actually had to do a couple of court proceedings recently just to get people proof and the final stamp of approval that they really own the land that they thought they've owned for 20 or 30 years because, well, I paid it off. I paid off the land contract. Well, there's one more step. So pulling out those pesky papers and going back through. The other thing that's sometimes a surprise when we start pulling out those deeds is, it's frequent that a couple will be in my office and they say, well, both our names are on everything. Everything is joint, so we're good if something happens to one of us. Then we start pulling out papers and, oh, except for that 40 that I inherited. I guess that's just in my name. And, oh, except for that, that other piece we bought, and you were out of town with your mom helping her with her health, and so I just signed off on it, and so that's just in my name. And so it's always a good time to find those surprises when we're all still in good health and able to follow up and take care of things. If you think this is a tough job for you, if it's your assets we're looking to transition, imagine how hard it is for someone who it's not their assets. So kind of getting that baseline of assets, and it's nice now with technology and things, it's easier for us to keep those lists on computers and just update them from time to time. Having that snapshot of assets for your family, if any of you have had to go through any sort of probate or trust administration when somebody passes away, you know, you may not know it, but your family will thank you. So after we've figured out what we have, then we want to set the goal. What are we trying to accomplish? And you may say, well, I told you already, I want to keep the farm in the family. But let's fine tune that a little bit. What does that mean? What does that mean for your farm, for your family? Does that mean that we're actually going to have people in the family farming that land? You know, raising cattle, milking cows? Are we going to have people active in the business? Or is it just that we just want to keep the land in the family? And so that even if we're renting that out to someone else, you know, we've kept that land in the Finke name or the Pittman name or whatever the case may be. And that answer may be different from family to family. And that answer may change over time because we may have hopes that those little tots running around will want to farm someday, and then they turn into teenagers and they might have their own ideas about what they want to do someday, and that may or may not be farming. If we want to keep that farm in the family and we want that to be active participation or whatever the case may be, then also ask yourself, what am I maybe willing to compromise in order to accomplish that goal? Because bottom line is, if we had unlimited resources, we had all the money in the world, we had all the assets in the world, and we had all the time in the world, these transition plans would be easy. My job would be easy. But there's always limitations. There's only so much cash to go around. A lot of things are outside of our control, not the least of which is Mother Nature. And so often there's going to be some amount of compromise in both generations in doing a succession plan. And so what does that mean for you? You know, even though you've lived frugally your whole life, now in retirement you say, hey, it's time for me to enjoy life. And even though I was getting by on $50,000 a year now, in retirement, I want to have $100,000 so I can travel and do what I want. Are you willing to start up giving some ownership of assets now to sort of facilitate the transfer? And is gifting or perhaps sales for less than fair market value part of what you're willing to do? Then here's the real hard question. You have more than one child, one of those children's involved in the farm, and you have some who aren't. How are we going to deal with that? Do you want those children treated equally so that someday when we pass away, they all get equal value of assets? Or are we more interested in them being treated fairly? And that may not mean that each child ends up with a check or an asset that comes to the same dollars and cents amount when we're all said and done. And in fact, because of the nature of how farms transition, most often if someone has committed and come back and provided services to the farm, and maybe they've been working for lower wage than where they might have gotten somewhere else, or have sacrificed in other ways, being treated equally with those non-farm children may not be anywhere near fair in that instance. And so trying to have that gut check moment with yourself, what does fair mean to me? Some people's solution to this is, okay, well, the farm assets go to the farm kids, and the non-farm assets go to the non-farm kids. Easy solution. And I'd say there's a couple of problems with that plan. The first of which is distinguishing really what are farm and non-farm assets. And so if you're putting together documentation, you want to be clear about that. I mean, is the house a farm asset or not? How about that garage? You know, the family car is in there, the personal car, but there's also a workbench in there that we use to fix farm equipment. So that can be complicated, but I think the bigger problem is often what those non-farm assets tend to be are some sort of cash in one way, shape, or form. Whether it's savings, whether it's retirement, whether it's life insurance, they tend to be cash assets. And so if we haven't done any transition leading up, and now that senior generation is starting to have health issues, they've got medical expenses, they've got nursing home expenses, what are the first assets of that split, our farm, non-farm split? What are the first ones that are going to get used? It's going to be that cash. It's going to be those non-farm assets, because we're not going to start selling acres of land to pay the nursing home bill. And if the nursing home would take, an acre a month or something, that might be an easier thing to deal with than kind of how that whole process works. And so while we may have thought that was fair at the time we set that up, in terms of, that balance of those values as we sit here today, that makes sense to me. That seems fair. If the non-farm side of it gets dried up, it's going to make those non-farm kids pretty unhappy if at the end of the day that farm child gets everything and they get nothing. So in determining that fairness equation, sometimes people just have that gut sense of what they think is fair, whether it's by percentages, whether by dollar amounts, that they decided, hey, if those non-farm kids each get $100,000, regardless of what the farm is worth at that time, that they should be content with that. That's fair. And sometimes you just have that sense of things. But there are kind of more scientific or step-by-step approaches that we can take to try to quantify that whole idea of sweat equity, of what that new generation coming in, the fact that they've been there and farming with you for 20 years while maybe those non-farm kids went to law school and are lawyers now, and so they're not there helping on the farm every day. And so sometimes we'll do that when we're getting ready to do an expansion or making a next step in the farm. We kind of take that snapshot of what it was worth before and view that appreciation going forward as being treated differently than what was there to start with. There's other ways that we can go through and calculate sort of value of services, or calculating out kind of any of those differences if we're getting less working for the family farm than we might have gotten working for the neighbor's farm or somewhere else. So just know that there are tools out there for us to try to quantify that, so we don't just have to pick that number out of the air. And like I say, so, sometimes people have that sense. They've thought about that number, they've considered what's fair. But that's not always the case, and like I say, this tends to be one of the biggest stumbling blocks, at least when we look at sort of the estate planning side of farm transition. And so if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all this farm versus non-farm and digging out all that old paperwork and kind of getting this process moving, what I sometimes suggest is that we divide up those challenges into the disaster plan versus the succession plan. And where I'm getting at there is, think of the disaster plan more as the estate plan side of things. If I and my spouse passed away tomorrow, and so we know what we have for assets, if we passed away tomorrow, how would we want things to go? So we don't have to worry at all about, giving up control or starting to give away assets or selling assets or what we need for retirement. Take all that out of the equation. And let's just say, as Bob would say, if the good Lord knocks tomorrow, where would you want things to go? And that plan can be changed and adjusted over time. But often I find people, because we're struggling with this whole farm versus non-farm, what's fair, we don't do it. We don't do the will. We don't get a trust. We don't start that process because we're waiting to come up with what's the perfect answer to make this fair between the kids. And in not making that decision, you've actually made a decision. Because if you haven't written a will, the great state of Wisconsin has written one for you. And it says that if you are married and you only have children from that marriage, you pass away, everything goes to your spouse. Or if they've passed away before you, then everything goes to the kids in equal shares. And that certainly can be a recipe for failure for a farm transition if, like in my family, there's 4 children, and you've only gotten a fourth of the farm, and now you have to figure out how to pay off 3 siblings. And so I encourage people, let's just get a start. Even if we don't think it's perfect, even if we think we might change it over time, let's at least start somewhere. And that can give us that starting point of moving forward and getting into the harder question, which is that transition plan. And so the transition plan is more the ongoing, the day-to-day. We've got this child who's interested in coming back to the farm, and we're trying to figure out what's their place going to be, how is this going to work. We have all heard horror stories of, well, Dad always said, if I came back, I'd get the farm. And what do you know, Dad passes away, and I didn't get the farm. And so I'm seeing more with that generation transitioning in, them wanting more certainty. Because there are lots of opportunities in agriculture, not just day-to-day farming. And so they want, they've heard those horror stories too. And so they want some certainty that if I do come back and farm, what's going to happen? How is this going to work? Am I going to be 60 and still not own anything because Mom and Dad are 80 and 85 and they haven't wanted to give up control of anything? They don't want to transfer anything because they're worried I'm going to get divorced or something else is going to happen. And so this transition plan is more thinking about how are we going to get there absent that good Lord knocking tomorrow. Instead, this path along the way of working our way into a transition. And I think this is always harder, the harder piece, because once you've done it, you've given away that 40. You've given away that machinery. You sold the cattle for 50% of value to, help the next generation get up and running. Once it's done, you can't undo it. And so there can be a lot of hesitation there. But on the flip side, the options we have decrease as time goes on. And a lot of that, is driven now from what I've seen. It used to be once upon a time, the thing we were really worried about was estate taxes. Now it's really more those long-term care expenses, that idea of, one of that transitioning out generation spending 5, 7, 10 years in a nursing home and, at the tune of $7,000, $8,000 a month. A farm can get eaten up in a hurry, even as our farm sizes are increasing. And so having some sort of path set, and I'm certainly not advocating that means that if, son graduates from UWRF with a degree in dairy management, that, day one of work, he gets a quarter of the farm. But setting up that transition, that goal we're headed to, figuring out how we're going to give credit for that sweat equity, or on the flip side, if we are ready to make some transfers because we're further down the road, putting some restrictions on those things, that if things don't work out, that we don't end up having to buy back from that junior generation what we gave them to start with. And there's nothing that makes parents less happy than having to buy back assets that they've gifted to the kids. So now that we've had all of our gut checks about what are we really trying to accomplish, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the importance of building wealth outside of the farm assets. And I understand that it's a pretty common thing that we're constantly reinvesting our profits, our savings, back into the farm. I mean, it happens all the time. But I do see on the back side of this that if all of our eggs are in that basket, and now it's time to transition, we're going to put a lot more strain on that farm moving forward to fund that transitioning generation's retirement needs, because we don't have anything else to rely on. And so the less we're placing on the farm as my retirement, the more options we're going to have to be able to facilitate a transfer in for that next generation. And look, it's always possible for that next generation to buy that farm from you, right? Theoretically, it's possible. But then you go see one of those bankers that are in the room and they say, wait a minute, we can't finance 100% of that. And so, particularly if we're going to continue to rely on that farm to directly provide retirement income to that transitioning generation. And so, certainly was my parents' philosophy that the farm is my retirement, and that's tough if the farm can't sustain that. That same farm that was provided for one family isn't just going to magically start being able to provide for two without us perhaps making some changes. That problem gets more difficult as people are living longer. Mom and dad are going to be around longer, or grandma and grandpa. And so we need to think about that longer time frame. And certainly if we haven't made any sort of transition or starting to transfer portions of the farm as we go along, if our transitioning generation is 80 or 85, and that next generation is 60, and they're starting to think about, well, I want to retire, but hey, I still don't have anything, and so I'm counting on the farm to be my retirement. That older generation is counting on it to be their retirement, and now we've got this 30-year-old going, wait a minute, how long am I going to have to work to pay for all of this before anything is mine? Another frequent comment is, well, I'll sell the farm and live off the proceeds. Well, number one, with our interest rates today, having a chunk of cash that we just put safely in a CD or a money market account, we're going to eat into that nest egg in a hurry, just because it's a lot harder to generate income. But the other issue is, if we started from the position of we want to keep the farm in the family, but now we're going to make the next generation pay top dollar for that farm, is that going to work? Those goals work together? So really, what can that transitioning in generation afford to pay? What price can they afford? And so if we have at least provided for some of that retirement income, the needs of that transitioning generation from something other than cashing out those farm assets, or the farm continuing to write us a check, even if we aren't providing any direct labor for the farm anymore, it really makes it difficult. It makes it a tough sell for that generation coming in. And if, like I say, if our goal is to keep that farm in the family, we want to get to a workable solution for both generations. Or, in some cases, we're looking at 3 generations that we're dealing with. So let's count those beans again and consider what those financial needs in retirement are. I do work with plenty of families where that transitioning generation says, I'd love to just give the farm to that next generation, but hey, I got to make sure I'm okay. And so a lot of times how we work into purchase prices or the financial terms of things is actually working backwards from what does that transitioning generation need? And so then work our way backwards into that purchase price. And I've got this slide frame sort of as, what we need in retirement, but I will say for the generation coming in, this isn't a bad exercise for them either. So what I say is create a personal budget. And boy, doesn't that sound like a lot of fun, right? But I find that it's often hard in farm families to really understand what those needs are, what it really costs to live, because we run so many expenses through the farm. On the flip side of that, I'm seeing a lot more farms where the farm is providing housing for that generation coming in. And, and maybe they're paying the utilities and they're paying the heat. And, hey, if you gotta go to town, you stop at the gas barrel and fill up with gas. And I'll tell you, my cash needs would be a whole lot less if someone else was paying my mortgage and my real estate taxes and my utilities. I could have a lot of fun if I didn't have all those bills. And so sometimes that transitioning generation can say, I'm working for peanuts here, Mom and Dad. This is not fair. Well, if you start considering all those fringe benefits and put those into the pool, well, hey, maybe we're not making such a bad wage when it's all said and done, when you consider all those things into the pool. So I think for both generations, it's a good exercise to really think about, hey, what's our monthly nut to crack? You know, what do we really need to kind of live the sort of life that we want to live? You know, what are those ongoing cash needs? And then aside from that, what sort of level of savings do you want to maintain? You know, every once in a while I start going through that asset list with a client, and I see that they've got, you know, $50,000 or $75,000 sitting in a checking account. I'll say, you know, is that earning you any interest? Well, no. You know, the reason you're keeping that much cash, well, I just feel better that if something comes up, if it's a rainy day, you know, I have that money. And that threshold is different for everyone as to what that rainy day fund, you know, what level that is for you. But let's know that, and let's make sure that you have whatever reserve, and you know, again, with that idea of farm versus non-farm assets, and maybe those non-farm assets going to the kids. Well, if that's our plan, and we're counting on that $100,000 rainy day fund to be what funds that inheritance, well, we better make sure that we can maintain and grow that number, not that we're using it up every month for our monthly living needs. So not just the kind of the cash in and out, but also what those reserves are behind. And so the last thing I ask you to consider is what I call here mustering the troops. Probably a lot of what I've talked about here today, even though it's not nuts and bolts and numbers and percentages, may have given you some gut checks of, oh, that sounds hard. There are all kinds of people out there wanting to help farmers keep those farms in Wisconsin, keep the cows in Wisconsin, keep the farms in the family. And so I encourage you, if you're starting to think about these things, use the knowledge of the people you work with now anyway. You know, when you're sitting down and doing your farm tax planning at the end of the year, bring this up. Start talking about it. Start getting some of these questions on the table. Hey, what are you thinking about? Hey, you know, Junior's thinking about coming back to the farm. You know, what do you think? How can we make that work? Your banker or credit union representative, if you work with a financial planner on a regular basis, or hey, if it's one of these nasty lawyers like me, you know, start the conversation. Start thinking about it. But there's also other advisors out there that have knowledge to assist you. There is available through DAPCAP as a free service, these farm transition facilitators. They can work you through some of this goal setting and some of this gut check fairness and that sort of thing. They're just there to help you work through some of that soft stuff before you get to that point of drawing up papers and that sort of thing. There's certainly, you know, there's plenty of attorneys out there that maybe do a lot of things but don't focus specifically on succession issues. And, you know, insurance professionals certainly get pulled in as well. You know, life insurance is often some part of the equation in putting together a transition plan. And so those folks are out there too. Overall, and the more I work in this area, the more I'm convinced that succession planning isn't a problem we solve once every 30 years. It's actually an ongoing business challenge. As we're making decisions about adding a new enterprise to the business, expanding, more cows, more acres, all those things factor into how this is going to be facilitated down the road, how we're choosing to direct our dollars, our profits. Those decisions really can position you or assure the failure of a future transition, depending on the particular needs of your family. And, you know, and I know this is hard, or it may not be what you want to hear. You may be sitting there thinking, you know, what does she know? But do consider investing not exclusively in the farm. Really having more of a balanced pool of assets really do make these transitions a whole lot easier. And the other thing, consider insurance planning for those long-term care expenses. You know, I really think about it as a $100,000 a year problem, and growing, unfortunately. And so, like I say, while we used to be real worried about those estate taxes, hey, 50 cents on the dollar going to Uncle Sam, with those limits, as Tammy explained, you know, being up over that 5 million mark, and certainly if you're a couple, you can double that number. So we're looking at, you know, 10, close to 11 million that we can protect and not worry about estate taxes. It's really that nursing home bill that can really crush us. And so, you know, I don't sell insurance. I'm sure there's some people in the room who do. But rather than, you know, directing some of those dollars maybe to life insurance premiums, thinking about long-term care insurance, and, you know, earlier is better. Unfortunately, having these nursing home planning discussions often happen when someone's already had a health event or they're 75, and, you know, if you can get insurance, it's going to be really, really expensive. And so more around that age 60, I would say, is more the sweet spot about thinking about that. I've got my contact information on there, and you know, don't hesitate to contact me about anything. I will be hanging out here now, and thanks so much for coming out today. Really appreciate it.